Hello everyone, my name is Natalie Amgott and I am a doctoral candidate in second language acquisition and teaching at the University of Arizona. Today I'm going to present to you my study entitled L2 Multimodal Composing Abroad, Remixing Languages, Cultures, and Identities. To get started, let's take a look at the rationale and an introduction for this study. So in recent years, literacy research has really touted the values of multimodal composing for encouraging students to make meaning from their full linguistic, cultural, social, and modal repertoires. These studies have illustrated how multimodal composing can support academic learning, self-reflection, and multilingual identities, as illustrated by the work by Pacheco and Smith, DeJanes, and Cummins and colleagues. So while research on multimodal composing has become more abundant in English and ESL contexts, there is still little research on multimodal composing in L2 or second language contexts, with some notable exceptions like Kumagai and L's work and Schmerbeck and Lutz's work on German language learning. So these led me, this kind of lack of research on multimodal composing in second language context other than English led me to think about how multimodal composing might be useful in study abroad context for language learning, how it might help students to expand their linguistic and cultural repertoire. For these reasons, this study explores the multimodal composing practices of 12 American students studying in Paris to learn French. The research questions guiding this study are: how do students reflect on their linguistic and cultural experiences through multimodal video reflections while studying abroad? And how do students leverage multiple modes to communicate their reflections? With the modes, I'm referring to video, visuals, text, voice, music, etc. There's a three-part theoretical framework guiding this study, and these are all complementary concepts. So the founding concept of this study is the theory of multiliteracies, which is a theory and a pedagogy that embraces multiple modes, languages, and channels of communication proposed by the New London Group in 1996. And it examines how these multiple channels of communication impact our interactions in the workplace and within our private worlds. So this approach also critiques the traditional and largely written literacy practices of the past for limiting meaning-making potential and underpreparing students for social futures full of linguistic and cultural diversity. The concept of multimodality falls under the umbrella of multiliteracies, and it involves combining images, texts, words, sounds, gestures, and other modes that are all imbued with personal, societal, and cultural meaning. So we see how multimodality further concerns how each of these modes are socially situated, and the combination of modes being used is greater than any one mode alone. Translanguaging is a third concept important to this study, and this is when we incorporate our unbidden multilingual practices and repertoires of multilingual students in our teaching, as stated by Conagaraja and Garcia. So this is a concept that is really interesting because instead of saying we're only going to talk English in this language learning context, we're only going to talk French, it encourages students to bring in all of the linguistic resources that they have at their disposal for learning. We're going to talk about some previous research on these three concepts, but first I want to elaborate a little bit more on what multimodality is, what multiliteracies is. One key concept of multiliteracies is the designs of meaning concept, and I have made this graphic here to illustrate what it is, but also to show you what an example of multimodal composing is. So I read about multiliteracies, I studied multiliteracies, and then I redesigned my understanding into this poster graphic of multiliteracies. That's an example of multimodal composition or of redesigning. So the principles of designs, this says that for multiliteracies, we start with available designs, which are the resources at our disposal. So in a language learning context in study abroad, an example that I have is when my students were walking in the streets near the Champs-Elysees, and they saw that there was a protest of the train workers, which they had heard about, but they hadn't seen yet. And it was a strike and a protest, and there were armed police officers there. There was a lot of news coverage, and they were listening to the chants of the strike. They were listening to the news reporters reporting on it, and to the police kind of yelling some commands. And they took it upon themselves they didn't understand really the social or historical context of what the strikes meant, because that's not something they were familiar with from their hometowns in the US. So they just started interviewing in French some passersby and some police officers. I was concerned for them when I saw that happening, but this helped them to design meaning, and everybody was really gracious with them in their French abilities, and they were able to understand the ideational, interpersonal, and textual functions of the protests that they were watching and all of the media surrounding the protests that they were trying to interpret by engaging socially and based on their own sociocultural, historical, and environmental contexts. So if they had seen the same picture of a protest in a textbook, which they perhaps had seen before similar pictures, it perhaps wouldn't have made as much of an impact, but because they were able to make the comparisons and interview people, they developed a richer meaning. And they remixed or redesigned their interviews of police officers to include their own voiceovers and reflections and their own pictures they had taken of the protests. So this transforming of meaning became a new available design that another French learner or anybody else who uses French could watch to understand what this protest was about and why the train workers were on strike. That's an example of what the designs of meaning are and how multimodal composing can be involved in that process. Research on multimodal composing and translanguaging has shown that it fosters engagement in students, it develops and affirms their multilingual identities. It also allows students to leverage their full semiotic repertoires to convey meaning through multimodal code meshing. So Pacheco and Smith have found this in their research, that students are able to leverage their different modes and different languages, their full repertoire, in the process and in the product of composing to convey their identities and to learn the content more clearly. And this work really inspired the current project to look at, in other L2 contexts instead of ESL, in French learning contexts, there's the same thing happening in a study abroad context, and what are the products, the student products look like. The methods for this study are here next. There were 12 participants in a 6-week French language and culture study abroad program in Paris. These included 11 women and 1 man aged 18 to 23. They were all majoring or minoring in French, and they were taking 2 courses with me throughout the 6-week third-year coursework on written and spoken French and cultural contexts, and each course involved making multiliteracies portfolios throughout the course, one that was more emphasis on reading and writing, and one more emphasis on listening and speaking, which is not a division that I would have chosen as a proponent of multimodality, but that was the way the courses were billed. So by doing, they were still encouraged to use all of the modes when they were able to: written, reading, speaking, and writing, listening, through their use of text, music, etc., as you'll see in their video blogs. So I collected data for this study, including these vlogs or video blogs that the students made and their Flipgrids. So students made 3 vlogs per their stay, one for every other week, and they made 3 Flipgrids, which were reflections, and these were on alternating weeks. So the reflections were on things that happened in class or excursions, and they were about a minute and a half, shorter reflections, and they would watch and respond to each other. It's just a video and audio, whereas the vlogs, students were using iMovie, and they looked something like this on the right, and they included voice, images, videos, music, as you see here, text, and so there were a couple more possibilities with modes there. Then I collected all of these. To analyze it, I used multimodal transcription and multimodal code meshing timescapes, both of which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And I used an iterative process of open and axial coding. So I started and I looked at, after I had made the transcriptions, I looked at what emerging codes were happening, emerging themes, and then I went back through the data several times. I created a code book and I refined my codes as I was going, and then I came up with some emerging categories that I was condensing and expanding as I went through the axial coding process, which was when I looked across each student's 6 data points to see if they had anything that was in similarity or any patterns that I was missing. And then I looked across all of the students and all the data points to see and make sure that I had included anything that was emerging from the data. So some common themes I found were that students were using these spaces for linguistic reflections, goal-setting practices, cultural comparisons. I also coded their modal use and when they were having a metamodal or a discussion of their own use of modes. So this is an example of part of my multimodal transcription process where I had a column for the time, the visual frame, the description of the video, anything that was happening in French and an English translation of that, text and music and translanguaging. And you can see an example from Esther's vlog. These are all pseudonyms, just a 6-second segment here. And this was really helpful for me for coding because I could see all of the modes at once with the description while I was doing it. So this is proposed by Fluent and colleagues, and that's what I employed for that. My findings illustrated that students were using the vlogs and video reflections to develop their multilingual identities through practices of metalinguistic awareness and goal setting and accountability. They also promoted transcultural repositioning, in which students were making cross-cultural connections and comparisons and discussing their emotional experiences. And students were traversing study abroad through increasing traversals of mode and space, which we will break these each down. So students developed their multilingual identities here. They used practice of rehearsal, repair, linguistic observations, and goal setting. So rehearsal involved students repeating their French speech, students using text, emojis, voiceover, filters, and freeze frames to rehearse French in a safe space and transform grammatical or vocabulary mistakes. This was coupled with practices of repair, in which students corrected their own vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, often orally, but also sometimes with text. And students often use gesture to punctuate and facilitate their reflection by making spatial and temporal references or by connecting to their audiences. We have some examples here. So this is a visual of a few seconds of Aaliyah's vlog, one of her vlogs. And in French, she was talking about being in the Pantheon and being in Versailles, making connections to sciences and physics because her major is biology, and the mathematical form of the sculptures. The students in French were able to make a lot of personal connections, as you see here. She was using gesture as well and voiceover here. So we see how Aaliyah corrects her original identification of Venus of someone I don't know to Venus de Milo, and she does that with the text here. She changes from a frame of herself talking to the camera at a park to the photo of an interesting clock that she saw at Versailles to the statue of Venus de Milo to clarify while she voices over and to provide this background on the mathematical and biological connections that she's making. The three main modes we have here, text, voiceover, and image, help her to repair in a clear and efficient way while still conveying her point and keeping the audience's attention. We have some examples here of students' goal-setting practices and how they kept each other accountable. The students used the video reflections, the Flipgrids, and the vlogs as a space for learning moments to talk about different vocabulary, slang that they had learned during the week, or even different mistakes like saying des cafés, du café, and deux cafés, and getting those mixed up, which messes up some coffee, some coffees, and two coffees. So getting two coffees when one of my students only ordered one coffee. And he explained this really well in his vlog and how he needed to work on his pronunciation so that he was more understandable there. So students also stated their goals: clarity in pronunciation, mastery of slang, comfort with conjugations. These were some common goals, as well as ability to retrieve vocabulary more easily. So they would say these goals in their videos, and then they used it. They were assigned to watch each other's videos, so it was a way to keep them accountable on their goals, which was not an original intention of having them watch each other's videos, but emerged as a neat result. So one student, Madison, said in her first vlog, "Mon objectif pour le programme, c'est d'améliorer mon français pour parler à la famille d'accueil sans problème. Je suis ambitieuse, je sais. My goal for the program is to get better at French, to talk to my host family without any issue. I'm ambitious, I know." And this was a goal that she did say that she achieved by her third vlog. She felt like she had less issues. She was mainly able to understand and even make some jokes. So being able to express sense of humor was a common theme as well, that students wanted to be able to do that as a linguistic goal. The vlogs and the Flipgrids also promoted transcultural repositioning. So this aligns with previous findings that intercultural competency and transcultural repositioning are fostered by the ethnographic nature of vlogs. Honeyford found this. And transcultural repositioning occurs when students make connections from in class and in the wild, so like the protest example, learning, and they're able to reframe their learning and perspectives in this process. So the example I mentioned with the students at the protests, they're able to reframe, oh, okay, this is a strike, this is a grève, this is what happens during a grève, and this is kind of the local reaction to it, and it's different than the way they understand a strike in the United States, perhaps. They were able to incorporate photos they had taken of pro and anti-immigration graffiti around Paris and make connections to their own lives living near a border in their university town in the US. Students also often interviewed tour guides and bus drivers or other locals, that they incorporated those interviews or remixed them into their video blogs to discuss cultural customs like, do people really eat baguette every day, and other such customs. So as students progressed throughout their program, their cultural comparisons went from macro to micro. So when they were the first week, they were making a lot of comparisons. This happens in France, and this happens in the US. And then this happens in Paris, and this happens in my hometown or in my college town. And then more micro, oh, I went to other parts of Paris or Europe, and not all of France or not all of Europe is the same. Not all of Paris is the same, even towards the end. So students are kind of able to de-essentialize those discrete cultural points that they may have been exposed to, or the stereotypes that they have coming in, to see really the rich cultural fabric and to be encouraged to change their perspectives as they learn. Here's an example from Hannah's vlog. She said, even though they told us no one talks about religion, My host mom always wants to talk about and share her Jewish culture and traditions with me, and she's Parisian. And then we have some French and American pop cultural connections. For example, Kendall, who was a Haitian American, she had gone to the Louvre with an excursion. The whole program went there. And incidentally, the day after we went, Beyonce and Jay-Z, this was summer of 2018, they came out with a video whose name I can't say here, but the video was filmed in the Louvre, and it was a critique of the lack of blackness in the Louvre. And Kendall watched this after she went to the Louvre and made a comment. She remixed the video into her comments and said, "C'était juste beaucoup de personnes blanches. Les tableaux, les artistes, tout blanc." It was just a lot of white people. The paintings, the artists, all white, in referring to the Louvre. So she was able to make this cultural critique and identify this problem of racism in the art at the Louvre. Students also traversed their study abroad through use of multiple modes and space. And Smith's studies previously have shown that reflecting through multiple modes increases over time as students are designing, as students are making products, and we see that here as well. So I used multimodal code meshing timescapes to analyze and for you to data visualize, and I have taken the example of 4 students here out of the 12. We have Mia, Emma, and Aaliyah who follow similar patterns as to the other students. And Esther's kind of a control that we're going to talk about. Esther considered herself a techie going into the program, so she felt really comfortable with designing on a variety of tools, like iMovie, which she's using here. So we see that she's using a lot of modes throughout all of her vlogs, 1, 2, and 3, from left to right. Mia, Emma, and Aaliyah, however, they started out and they were just using vlog, which is when they, like my little picture you see in the top, it's just them talking to the computer. And maybe they had some translanguaging in there, but over time they grew to use a voiceover, they had included music, they had photos, they had videos while they were walking, that's the purple, and they grew to use more modes and to layer more modes. Part of this was because they were able to watch each other's, they watched each other's vlogs and they saw how great Esther's was. And also we talked a lot about multimodal composing in class and had some mini workshops. So they increased in their modal traversals and in their uses of languages. We had some heritage speakers of Vietnamese. We had some speakers of Spanish and one heritage speaker of Vietnamese and one of Haitian Creole. So they were able to talk to multiple audiences at the same time through this. So we see here that reflective vlogging is able to create a sort of transnational space among multiple groups where students and their viewers are participants and viewers, creating less of a divide across this study abroad space. And students grew to identify as a French speaker. They showed their actual and desired memberships in this learning community through their goal setting practices and metalinguistic awarenesses. Their learning was social and individual. They individually did these projects, but they watched each other's, and they cultivated their journeys through these iterative affordances of repeating in their vlogging, sharing, and were able to try on multilingual voices and share with peers and a broader audience. So ultimately, they were able to reposition themselves as multilingual speakers or legitimate L2 users. This study is limited in that there is already a lot of student investment in being linguistically and cultural competent if they're studying at this level in France. Multimodal composing, however, has the implication of being able to foster reflective attitudes in language learners with proper scaffolding, and explicitly considering incorporating the language of multimodal composing and code meshing could be important for our language teaching and study abroad, and I would argue domestic contexts. Practices of repair and gesture are venues for future research, and also looking at the way that different ages, levels, and contexts use multimodal composing while learning a second language. For more information, I was just published on the same study with the same title in the L2 journal, so feel free to check it out. And I would love to hear from you with any questions that you might have. That's my email. Here are my references if you want to screenshot them. And I thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of L2DL.